All right, we're recording.
Okay. So, hi everybody, welcome to the TST meeting. Today, we're going to discuss a couple of topics. One will be a gRPC brigade proposal from Aaron of some of the approaches to adding gRPC to ONOS. And then the second topic will be discussion of some revised and relabeled community roles for various ONOS contribution groups. So I think with that, I don't think we have any shout outs or any acknowledgements. So I think with that, we can probably move to the gRPC one. What? Yeah, David said he was going to be able to make it.
All right. So where's the phone that should be talking for? Oh, okay, cool. Okay, so this is basically broadly the proposal for adding gRPC as a northbound for the ONOS. For the ONOS project. Initially, this would be for core services, and we, Brian and I have been discussing like how to do extensibility and sort of long-term approach to it. So motivation for this is just basically much faster access than we currently have to these services, because if you access them via REST, it's all synchronous, it's all blocking. You can't approach what you get with an on-platform application to not platform app. And that's what we're trying to fix here is much faster access, which means we can push apps off platform. Which means we can sort of improve our isolation. We can write in other languages and have ONOS in a pretty straightforward way. And we can provide APIs that are similar to the granularity of the Java APIs. Any questions, comments? Just shout out at any point if you do.
Yeah, compared to, presumably you could get both of these, except for writing in other languages, just use like Java RPC. Like, is there a good reason that doesn't work? Or
I don't Java RPC.
Yeah. But there are lots of those.
Yeah, this one just seems, I suppose, a good way of modeling our objects, and it provides.
Flexible gRPC is like, it's in Java and works fine with Java. Maybe it's actually the best of the possible, Java RPC options. But if there are a number of them, there's some that are sort of built into. There's been a lot of them built into the Java platform, and there are a bunch of. I guess there are many of them. Maybe gRPC is the best one.
But I can do some exploration there, but I can get back to you offline on that.
The sort of nice thing about a native Java RPC is that the objects are within the API on each side or pretty close. So that's one sort of nice thing about it.
Yeah, that's one of the.
And it's quite possible that gRPC and Java would basically give you that. Although, I guess that's certainly one of my considerations is that is the off-platform is the separate process, the multi-process API, essentially the same as the in single process API for Java clients? If not, why not?
Well, I think that's a good segue to something that maybe we can talk about later. Like, why is there an internal API and an external API? Why aren't they the same? And I think that definitely should be part of our discussion.
Yeah. Okay, I can jump on to the next one. So the proposed design is fairly simple, but this is only a small segment of what would eventually be. This would be like the first phase, which is just to say we have an application that has a gRPC stub and can handle the models in whatever language it would be. There we go. It's around there. So the gRPC stub would be in whatever language the app is in. It would basically receive the messages and allow access to their fields, whatever relevant information. You have an encrypted connection to the gRPC server side, and really what you have here is just a gRPC northbound. Northbound is essentially, so in this one it's a translation utility mostly. In the so there's consideration of turning it more into a sort of registry along the lines of OSGI, so that you can register new services with it, and basically each then there would be services along here. Each one would have its own translation utility, and each one would then basically provide access to the core and access out. Oh, oops. Yeah, so this would be the very, very basic version, which would just be making calls to the basic API, like the basic ONOS services, not extensible at this point. Okay, let's see. So approach to the protocol buffer models. So the idea here is to make it automatable, because realistically, the only way this has a good shot of being, like, staying up to date is if the process, well, there are two ways, but the easiest way, the first way, is to basically ensure that you can look at the Java classes and automatically generate the appropriate protocol buffer models, and so that way they can be guaranteed to remain in sync. There are a few technical problems with this I can get into if anyone's interested in that bit. If not, I gloss over it for the moment. But basically the structure will be, basically you dive down, the way to do this is you basically dive down from the top, and you go to any state that either is public, protected, or has an accessor method. You dive down, and if that's not the case, you dive down into that class, create, and look, basically dive down until you hit primitives in every case, and then just encode those primitives. And that's how you generate your protocol buffer models.
Is this an automatic process or is it a manual process?
So the idea would be, so there's sort of two considerations. It was originally, the idea was to just automate this and basically make it, you can just create whatever models you need for objects. We were discussing earlier today was possibly it makes a little more sense to, I mean, at least this is kind of, in newer objects, there's a possibility to use them as a sort of representation without corresponding Java representation, but that's
Yeah, I would suggest that whenever you find yourself doing that, it's a sign that you should probably, that there's an abstraction error in your existing API. You should probably create a Java abstraction and just have its interface be automatically generated.
Well, so the question here is whether, like, as a project, we want to move to, like, protobufs as the authoritative definition language for the objects and services, or whether we want to continue to use Java as the authoritative source for the objects and services.
Yeah,
and
it's a really interesting idea, and you know, something bugs me. I'm sorry.
Well, so the thing is, if we want to continue to use Java as the authoritative source, and we want to generate gRPC models based off of Java, we've basically got to write an automated suite that can keep the generated models up to sync with the Java code. And this sounds like it's going to be a lot of work, and there's a lot of considerations about, like, making sure the models evolve in ways that are compatible with previous versions of the model, so that the generated code, like, it's a whole big thing. So if we're willing as a project to say for the public services, both used internally and externally, we're going to have protobuf defined interfaces and objects, then we just have to have sort of one-time mechanism, or maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, you know, however long the transition period takes, a couple times mechanism for seeding the proto models with the Java API ones.
Yeah, so I think there's in long term, there is a significant benefit of moving towards protobufs being the canonical representation rather than Java.
Yeah, I agree completely. At least for things that you think you're going to be sending over the wire.
Well, yes, and
yeah.
for a number of reasons, because this could potentially kill two birds with one stone. Not only will it give us sort of off-platform high-performance API, but it will also give us intra-cluster communication, which with portable serialization.
Yeah, with like zero serialization, essentially.
Well, so the efficiency is definitely something that we were interested in, which is one of the reasons we actually chose protocol buffers without even looking any further into things like Java RPC. But primarily, I think what's something important, at least in this context, is the ability to be able to evolve the encoding in a way where the old language, basically the old decoders can understand it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And you can, over time, completely evolve the model into completely something different.
stuff like that. It's really quite amazing. So I think it's definitely really
So I
Yeah,
think the long term.
There's another advantage to that too, which is currently, when you have to do translation to our internal Java representation, you can't necessarily include additional fields very easily. Like, for example, if you have like a JSON format by which we take information over REST, if the native object doesn't understand a field, it will ignore it or throw an error. Whereas with gRPC, the protocol would enable you to take sort of data off the wire that you don't necessarily care about all the fields of, and you could still store it in the format from which you received it. And then other consumers of that data further down the line might actually be able to take advantage of details you didn't care about at sort of the store layer, or like for example, in the device service kind of cares about device ID. It doesn't necessarily care about other extensions that you may need there. So as long as it can pull that one field off and pass the data along in the representation it received it, other applications could leverage parts of the data, even if they're compiled. They could be compiled against different protobuf versions, yeah.
So what you're saying is basically you could potentially allow people to allow clients to extend the data representation in a way that wouldn't be lost if you pass it through an ONOS.
Could be, yeah.
So I think the long-term goal is to sort of head in that direction. The question is how to get there, right? And Brian alluded to the plan of one approach that might ease that transition. But I think in the meantime, I think if you want to provide protocol, so gRPC capability, so I think we have to approach it from the stand where Java is the canonical representation and the gRPC protocol is the derived one.
Right.
And how do we come up with it as efficiently as possible?
Right. So this presentation mostly pertains just to the very first bit, which is just let's expose services through the ON.Lab.
You mentioned your plan to over time flip that.
The idea was to flip it, yeah.
Yeah, the canonical representation would be the protobuf representation, so that would kind of have a lot of kind of interesting advantages. And it also incurs some runtime overhead, which and arguably complexity.
And
is not to be underestimated.
for the most part, our objects are mutable, and one of the criteria is to make sure that attribute was preserved. And I believe Google protocols will fit that.
Did you say immutable or
Immutable.
Immutable. Interesting.
So the protobus, at least the Java code that produces the protobus, that protobus compiler produces, has builders. Of course, you can manipulate those, and when you stamp out the object, the resulting object is immutable.
So most of the presentation is going to focus on sort of just the very first phase, exposing our interfaces for like core services to the through to northbound consumers. But yeah, so there's sort of a lot of room for evolution here. So more on this is actually very, very specific. I'm not gonna, if people are interested, I can dive into exactly this. Basically describing the structure, how these how the models will be built out, and basically the general design is to guarantee it's modular. There's no need to redefine any model. Basically, it's the basics of object-oriented programming. You want to make sure that every bit is reusable, modular as possible, and that's kind of the impetus behind this. There's also some tagging optimizations we can dive into, but that's not especially important. The next part would be the translation utilities. Translation utilities, at least in the beginning. So the discussion here is more about sort of handcrafted translation utilities, but in the same way that protocol, that the models could be auto-generated, the idea would be that once you've reduced every structure down to its primitive fields, basically, translation utilities could also be automatically generated. Basically, if this approach, before we go for the actually switching the canonical representation, the idea would be, if we want this to work without that, everything has to be automatically generated to make sure everything remains in sync. So translation utilities along with protocol buffer models would need to be automatically generated to sort of reflect any changes in classes.
Well, it seemed to be, so what you seem to be saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is you're sort of proposing that, for these Java objects, you create proxy objects whose internal representation is for them.
Yeah, essentially.
That seems to be, how are you planning to make sure that those objects remain in sync across, sort of concurrency and across nodes and those sorts of things? I think this sort of architecture with proxies always runs into consistency problems. And so, how are you kind of dealing with that?
Well, so they're not remote proxy objects, they're local proxy objects. They're basically a shim on a local machine that enables some visibility into an immutable object. And so because the canonical representations are immutable and the
canonical representations, okay, they're both immutable.
Right.
So you're saying they can't come out of sync.
Well, the underlying backing object can't change. So whatever the proxy exposes, whether you pull the fields out at the time of initialization or whether you do it lazily, it can't come out of sync because the underlying object can't change.
But what if the other underlying object like goes away or it is no longer used or I guess strange things like that? Yeah.
This is about
or is no longer accurate for some reason. It may be immutable, but the thing that was based on has changed or something like that.
No, this is a valid concern, especially when it comes to more complex objects, because in the very simple case of, let's say, we model a device, the pulling out of fields, an immutable object and an immutable representation of that object, they're the same, and they can't really fall out of sync. I mean, yes, it can disappear.
I guess, like, here's an interesting thing that can happen, right? And an object is immutable, but it's actually removed from, like, the network graph or something. And so nobody on the Java side has a handle to it anymore. But you're on the protobus side, you still have a handle to it. It's like something that can happen when
But we can have a similar problem now, right? When you, let's say, you get a list of devices, we can have a list of immutable things, and then you can store it, stash it somewhere, but the device would no longer really be present in the system because, let's say, it was administratively.
Yeah.
And so then the application that has a cached copy of it now has basically data that we still have some issues with it. But I think in the context of these sort of shim objects, they would be used primarily as just a means of transforming information between what's going and coming in on a wire and what's going towards the image of the system.
I think the key, I guess, is to sort of make sure that, like, when the object disappears, its shim should also disappear, I guess, or something like that.
But I think but because there's
sort of a reverse dependency. Right?
Yeah, but I think the shim, at least I think right now the plan is for the shim to the services are basically for the most part they're stateless in a sense that the backing is entirely inside ONOS core. And so, for example, if an off-platform application retrieves let's say listing of devices, now there's a list of devices, it can also, that same application can receive notifications about updates because it can sort of add listeners, right? Yeah. So the remote listeners can be notified through probably detached dispatch notification mechanism, and the notification on the remote side can then be used by the client to prove its own cache if it has any cache.
Yeah, I guess that's, the idea is, how does cache invalidation work even for
Sure. I'm sure there will be some interesting problems to deal with, but I think that at least the goal is to use for this sort of what could be labeled as an intermediate approach to gRPC, the long-term approach being fully flipped.
Yeah.
This intermediate approach should be based on as thin layer as possible, where it has no state.
Yeah, and so especially there are some cases where it'll involve a bidirectional streaming, in which case you could send invalidation messages as necessary. You can notify as quickly as you're notified of an object's disappearance on your own side. And that would especially come up in sort of the more complex representations. Like, and I'll get into this in a bit, I think. But the idea would be, suppose you want to represent the topology graph. My proposal is to, instead of representing it by actually sending across the entire set of nodes, is to basically provide a sort of iteration type deal that where you're actually streaming, you're sending requests from neighbors and receiving basically bidirectional streaming. So whatever you receive is actually as fresh as the internal representation has.
Oh, really interesting, as opposed to
Sending over a static.
yeah, as opposed to like generating a snapshot, and then, which
that
you don't
could present
necessarily
its own
have
issues.
to
And that
read
was-
all of it or not.
So for the discussion, that definitely needs to be had is whether snapshotting is more logical way to approach this,
Yeah.
or whether, so I
I mean,
could advocate.
usually iterators iterate over a snapshot. Iterators iterating over something that's not a snapshot usually cause all kinds of problems. Yeah.
Okay, so that's yeah, so, okay. That could present another interesting thing, which is how to snapshot data like that. Okay. So translation utilities, the gRPC services, which are, the actual meat of this, is basically supposed to have, the idea would be to support a one-to-one mapping of the actual service APIs to what's exposed via gRPC. As I mentioned earlier, for more complex services, it would be backed hopefully by streaming, because it poses sort of, it's rather expensive to just dump that huge pile of data all at once, especially if it's not needed all at once. The exponential gotcha snapshotting rather handling changes in the back of the state. And so my idea would be basically these wrappers would be written in language. The other thing is for other language support, they'd have to be language-specific packs that have sort of a way of handling these representations. So suppose you want a representation of your graph or your network graph, you need a way to understand that in Python so there would need to be some sort of something to aid in interpretation of the language. And this is once again not like immediate. So obviously first would be low-hanging fruit, the one-to-one RPC calls, where you pass out an object, receive it back, and you're done.
For the most part, though, we should let the gRPC compiler do it everything, right?
Yeah, it will.
Does gRPC give you a notion of iterators and language support or not?
So what, I don't believe so, but it does provide.
Nice to deal with collections, right?
It looks like how it deals with it.
Well, so gRPC gives you streams.
Right.
So you can have a stream as a return type, and if the stream is a return type, you as the client can ask for the objects in the stream one by one.
Well, that sounds good, because, I mean, I can think of, thinking whatever Python, Java, C++, they could all deal with, they're all have capabilities of iterating over the string.
You kind of hide it behind, you basically make your own next call.
Yeah, so you tell gRPC when you're ready to receive the next object in the stream.
That would be, and then so we have sort of timeline when I'd like each thing to be ready. So for the K release, I'd like to convert many, hopefully the majority of the services. It really depends on how effective or like how large and how efficient the brigade is, how quickly we all get up to speed. So that would be service interfaces and example applications, just sort of demo what this the functionality we're shooting for. The L release would be completing all the core services, having gRPC representations of them. Also, hopefully, some alternate language packs for the more complex objects that need to be supported by, like we just discussed, streaming and future work. And sort of this would be either getting to complete automatic generation or moving to actually using this as the basic, as the internal representation.
Are you suggesting that initially you are going to write these translators, and or are you going to just handcraft gRPC? So how handcraft you wrote the file?
It's a little less right now. It kind of depends. So there were sort of two possibilities for adding on. So in the case where if we're shooting to eventually have gRPC become the economic representation, then I don't think it makes too much sense to spend a lot of energy on translation utilities, because eventually they'll just be sort of phased out. So to build at that point, I think it's more efficient just to handcraft them for the short term and eventually phase them out and be done.
So you're estimating that the amount of time it would take you, I mean, it's all an interesting trade-off, right? To write, if you have, 10 APIs that you want to create, right, you could either, two options, right? You could either, write a translator that creates them, and writing that 11th versus extending my translator so it works with the 11th set of input file, right? So it's not obvious to me which way is better, but I guess that seems like the decision you have to make.
It might be better just to, frankly, it might be best. If you have a pressing need for gRPC, if you don't, so today we don't seem to have a pressing need for gRPC, though if he had it, I'm sure it would it would be used.
Yeah.
But I don't think we have anybody specifically block line on any gRPC because workarounds are you can use REST API, or if you really want performance, you just place yourself on Java and expose some other interfaces to your ON.Lab function. So we have workarounds for this, but it would certainly be useful. But we could take a look at it and say, how much work is this? Because the problems with doing it automatically may be very difficult because there are a lot of corner cases. Brian alluded to some of those, which having to do, how do we do generation from Java to gRPC in a way that manages continuity from version to version, and as the internal model evolves. Besides, the gRPC has some nice notions for versioning things over time if it's used as a source anyway. So it might be that that's too expensive because it's too complicated. And then doing it manually, clearly, if you want to do it across a broad swath of ONOS services, that's just brute force work that you have to, and it becomes a liability that you have to keep maintaining stuff. So clearly, that one is a long-term, is a non-starter. So if you had a pressing need for it, you might say, maybe it's worth to do it for a subset of these services where we have a need for doing it. And I think that's what Aaron was alluding to, might be something to do.
Yeah, so my thinking is precisely along those lines, that, you try to do it, do it manually for a few, interfaces, few classes, or whatever objects are, and then think really hard about how much of that can be automated.
Exactly.
And if you do 85% of it in an automated way, great, and do the 15% by hand.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So basically just leveraging your time, but usually, like most programmers, I lean towards automation.
Yep.
Even, which, means that I'll spend 2 weeks writing a tool that I only use once for 5 minutes, but if I ever need that again, I'll
no, I get it.
It's not always the right trade-off, but usually, automation.
Writing a script to automate this process, if it just has to be done kind of once and is going to be kind of like looked over or hand checked, is very different than writing kind of a robust generator that's going to generate things in deterministic ways and be compatible from version to version.
Just be like a helper.
But given what our long term is, it might be potentially and lack of potentially pressing need to do something in short term. Stepping back and taking a look at it, maybe the best approach might be just to simply say, hang on, we're gonna just pursue the long term goal.
Yeah, that's another.
That might be an approach.
Yeah, that makes
Though I do think it would. I think having said that, I do think I think that we should at least pursue the short-term goals at least until the K release, and then do a sort of a retrospective on this and figure out should we go further into L release. But I think when it comes to the future work, my suggestion there would be, unless we've done the automated generator from Java APIs to Google protobufs as part of that L release stuff, sort of as the 80% type thing, we shouldn't probably do it. If it goes beyond that, then we probably ought to invest in figuring out how to flip the relationship.
We're gonna have a bunch of interns this summer.
Yeah, thinking that actually is
every intern.
Welcome to the nonprofit codemonkey.org.
So part of the other thought behind the difficulty of automatic generation was considering, we were discussing what happens if someone else wants to introduce a service, is when we do generation, we sort of need to know what the previous version looks like, so we don't end up stepping on the toes of other tags. So basically, we don't end up, it's a backward compatibility issue. And so we either need people to put, like I'll be discussing before, either we need to put annotations in the code that this should be tagged as such in the protobuf model built from this. Basically, there's a problem if in a different version, the same tag number is assigned to a different type of object, then you break backward compatibility. So you need to make sure that tags are never reused.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm not sure what tag is, but my thought is that it would be the version of an object should be synced to the version on it. Sorry, there's no other.
Yeah, but Aaron's talking about over time. So with Google protobufers, how familiar are you with Google protobufers? So basically, each field, or each environment structure has sort of a value you assigned, and should be unique within that structure. And then you should never, if you obsolete a field, you should, so you are basically eliminating that number, and that number should never reappear again, just on the chance that when you let's say you're talking about to an object 3 generations to an entity which understands object which is 3 generations old, so that you say I'm talking about field 5, you both know that you're talking about the same field.
Yeah, I understand. I know how you're saying. I guess it seems like it shouldn't be rocket science to actually generate the fields on a release basis and have that
You could have
connected to the release, and
Sure.
then you can just reuse it.
Yes. It could be done through annotations, could be done through sidecar files,
Yeah, I think
whatever
it
else.
can just be done that's something that is clearly automatable, but it needs it, right?
Yeah. So there are some complexities, but it might be an interesting project. I think since we're running, is this your last slide?
This is it.
Okay, so I think we can probably transition to talking about the next subject because we have talked about it. Thanks, Aaron. Good.
How do I turn off sharing?
I think this time, I think Brian will take it.
Oh,
You
yeah.
can just seize it, right?
Yep.
And we can talk about the
This
community
hopefully
roles.
will be a short topic.
Yep.
So, let me share my screen. All right. So, basically what I just wanted to go over briefly was kind of the formalization of some of the community roles that have sort of implicitly evolved, but just thought it might make sense to formalize them at this sort of setting, and then update the wiki with the additional roles, just sort of for the hope of transparency and just so people have an idea of things. So, as many of you are already familiar, we have a module owner role in the community. This is just kind of a recap. So module owners can give +2 for the specified parts of the code base which they're nominated. Initially, nominations cover some subset of the code, and they can be expanded to more modules as sort of proficiency and interest broadens. And the responsibility of module owner is to maintain the quality of contributions for the areas of the code base that they have ownership, as well as to provide feedback for these reviews in gRPC. So I think that's not new. The only thing that we thought about adding here was just an alias called the super module owner, which basically just means you have ownership of the entire code base. There's already several people who have ownership of the whole code base, and this would just be a way of sort of referring to these individuals. There's more details on the module owner program here in the wiki that you can take a look at later if you want. The other role, which is sort of a new role, this is sort of a role where we've had some people have implicitly had these rights, but thought it might be useful to formalize it. This is basically a maintainer. The roles here would be to administer, you get administrative rights to the gRPC project. This would enable you to create new branches or repos, push rights to repos if or when necessary as part of releases. And then also you get a +1 verification flag, which would enable you to bypass the automated build verification process for circumstances where the build is unavailable or there's changes that are not necessarily applicable to the test process. It's worth noting that this is somewhat of an orthogonal role to the module owner track. Module owner track's about doing code reviews. This is about doing sort of build release processes, code cleanup, maintenance, reorganization of the project, etc. Candidates for this role would need sort of extensive experience with the code structure, source and source code, and they're sort of the custodians for the project. So just to kind of put another way, we currently have module owners. They used to be called module owners, still will be called module owners. There are some number of module owners that have ownership of .star, sort of all paths. We'd call these people super module owners. Informally, this group was called core ONOS developers in gRPC. There'd be the addition of a new role called the maintainer. And then it would be the role of the TST to grant these roles to community members by majority vote, as we've done for module owners. So I have an initial set of nominees that I was going to propose based on sort of the informal sort of privileges people currently have, and I'll put these on the TST mailing list. If there are additional individuals that you think might be suitable for these roles or would like to nominate yourself, feel free to nominate yourself or individuals you think might qualify to the TST mailing list, and the TST can consider that, assuming this sort of notion of maintainer and super module owner.
So the super module owner is there, if you're already on a TST.
So it turns out that actually TST membership does not grant you module ownership or project maintainer status.
So it doesn't get you project maintainer, but you are essentially a super module owner.
That's not true today.
That's not true. Why not? I can come in code anyway.
So you are a super module owner, or you're a module owner with .star. You are.
Also, you have to be pro.
Right. So the TST. So it's sort of three.
TST is just a virtual group.
Yeah, a TST is a virtual group, not necessarily related to code. The TST is responsible for granting module ownership and maintainer, and sort of newly maintainer status to individuals, but does not necessarily guarantee those rights for the TST member.
Got it.
So if that sort of makes sense, I think we can publish this.
What are the criteria to become a module?
That's a good question.
You have to wear a fun outfit.
You have to wear a cape.
And a pointy hat.
Well, so I think that's definitely worth.
You need to in some way demonstrate that you've got a good proficiency of the code base.
Right. So I think it would be sort of impractical to have to sort of collect them all, gain module ownership of every single area. That would be impractical. So that's
where is it probably at ONOS building?
That's a great question. I'll put it in the notes. I don't know what the criteria would be. I don't think it should be having to have every part of the code base. I don't know whether it's, we define some breadth of code that we sort of deem sufficient or whatever. I don't know do you have a proposal? Okay. It would probably be good to define that, because it would sort of provide a good transition pathway from becoming a module. Like at what point are you module owner enough to become just super module owner? That's a good question. I don't think, had too many folks make that gap, and yeah, it would be good to have it defined. So perhaps in the process of putting this on the wiki, we can try to put a proposal together for that.
Another question is, do we have a process for reviewing and then possibly revoking such status? For example, Madame is not officially with ON.Lab anymore, and yet it is on the list for.
So this is something I think we have to be a little, maybe I'm saying this and I'm being a little selfish. but hold on.
Sure.
I think super, whatever, commit rights, right? The fact that you can give +2 and push code to the code base. If this is if we're saying this is a really an open source project, then
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
yeah.
I think that these sorts of roles should be independent of a particular individual's affiliation. But there is, let me make this bigger because we all aren't equals here. I thought there, hold on. There we go. So, there was somewhere in here, revoke, I don't remember, remove, somewhere on a document, there was something about module owners who misbehave, or module owners who disengage from the community can have their status revoked.
Okay.
And so it's more a factor of someone deciding to remove themselves from the project or misusing their powers, rather than necessarily a change in affiliation. We have not to date revoked module owner status for anyone, but we could potentially make that an item that the TST reviews quarterly or annually or something. But yeah, fortunately we haven't had misuses yet of the process.
In that second paragraph.
Oh, here?
Lose owner status.
Owners who are not performing their responsibilities will receive initial warning and may lose their status. So we haven't to date issued any warnings, but we could potentially, to an individual who was no longer participating in the project, say, hey, are you still interested in contributing?
Is it true that, is this statement true? Module owners are mostly people who are working on apps of ONOS?
So here's the list.
We do have core areas.
No, I know we do, but I'm saying like is there a majority of stuff that goes towards the apps?
I mean, we're trying, given the fact that we're pushing things towards the apps, right, for modularity and optionality of loading, there will be a lot of development there. But there's still a lot of module owners you will find that have actually rights inside the core code. Pierre would be an example, Jean would be an example.
Most module owners have rights to one or more apps, and they also usually have some other areas of code, it seems, as well.
Show has right to core.
Now, another question will be, if and when we decide to start disaggregating the repo and pushing more apps into their own repos, what does module ownership look like? I think we can sort of maintain the same notions, and then it may just be for certain applications they decide not to use the plugin, and a module owner for an app has full reign of the app. So yeah, I think that's still okay. But I think having this role of being able to review code across the various repos that we have under the umbrella of the ONOS project does continue to make sense.
I was just trying to find a line between module owners or module owners. I don't know.
I think the biggest line is that module owners sort of reflect an acknowledgement for sort of developing an expertise in a particular area of the code. And a super module owner would just be an acknowledgement that you've sort of developed enough breadth and area depth to justify sort of more reign.
And also, essentially, the show of restraint, right?
Yeah, exactly.
When you don't know.
Exactly.
While you have the right doesn't necessarily should exercise, right?
Yeah, I think that's actually my sort of next thought on this, the super module, maybe the naming, maybe you want to rethink the naming, because it looks like it's, I mean, technically it is someone with greater privileges, but I think you might want to rename it in a way that doesn't sound better than module owner.
Okay.
Super module owner sounds better, and it sounds like something that everyone would want to aspire to, whereas really, probably it's the opposite, because that means we'll get all these review requests, you'll have to do a lot of maintenance and all this crap, and,
You'll have work.
We want people in, you have people at work, and they sort of.
Project maintainer is actually a punishment.
No, it is. I mean, like administering Garrett is. It's such a nightmare.
When I put it that way, it sort of gives me pause. I'm like, well, there's probably no justification for me being a super module owner at all. On the other hand, there sort of is justification because that means that now there's an additional person that you can ask to do work when you're not available. So I will actually do it. So in my role as like Brian's occasional assistant, it actually makes sense for me to be a super module owner.
Which comes to responsibility,
Go
right?
and fix that. Basically. So, yeah, I recommend changing it to.
Do you have a recommendation?
I'm not sure.
People who are real careful about stuff.
Yeah.
Because that's what it boils down to, right? It's like,
I mean, so my claim to fame is that I've committed no code to ONOS at all. Well, it's not entirely true, it's mostly true. And I never use the +2 button except on So I can
Okay, well, perhaps we can start the process of putting this information on the wiki, also for the project maintainer. And if there are suggestions, feel free to update them on the wiki yourself or propose them in a follow-up TST.
Sounds good. Thanks, Brian. All right, I think that's it for today. End a little bit early. See you next week.